Today, I wanted to make a video talking about the things that I wish I knew when I was trying to break into tech sales 3 years ago. Obviously, there's a lot of different things that can apply, but that being said, I distilled it down to 5 and want to start with the interview process itself. I think having no exposure to tech sales in the past, I was so worried about how does it work? What do I do? What are the perfect answers? And I recently made a video on this talking about how, one, it's not important per se. Yes, you want to practice individual question and answers and have very concise and succinct stories. But that being said, it helps to better understand the entire framework of an interview, and it's why I make content like this. And again, just quickly summarizing a video I have much more in depth on, is usually the frame of a first round entry level interview is going to start with introductions and them asking you about your background. At that point, if you've done it well and effectively and you have meaningful stories, that's going to take anywhere from maybe 7 to 10 minutes. And the next 7 to 10 minutes of the call is roughly going to be focused on that company. What do you know about that company to date? The recruiter or sales manager is then probably going to tell you a lot about that company as well. But ideally, you come to the table prepared with 1 or 2 insights on the company, whether it's their sales training program, whether it's how great their product is compared to the competitors in the landscape, etc. And that's going to be a subtle thing that you can position yourself well as a well-informed and studious candidate. People always ask, how many questions should I ask? What kinds of questions should I ask? And there's elements to that, but again, if you're building that cohesive story because you know the entire framework of an interview, then the specific question should be tied to, more broadly, your interest on the role itself. If you're coming from a different background, you could fairly ask them, based on our conversation today, obviously not having experience, I'm excited to break into tech sales, but what are areas you see I could improve? The list goes on, but my point being is, yes, you want to prepare for these individual questions, but the entry-level interview of a tech sales role, an SDR role, is almost identical regardless of where you interview. And when you know that, it takes away the stress of over-preparing for every single interview or worrying about the ins and outs. When you know the framework, you can navigate it more successfully. I think in my case, having been an engineer in the past and now in tech sales, I overstudied, whereas most people don't do any. And so my point being in this next point is that if you do maybe 2 hours of really focused studying once you're deep into the funnel of an interview, that puts you ahead of like 90+% of candidates, especially at the entry level. Now, I've been in scenarios where my own background, when we're talking about AE positions above the SDR role, yes, maybe I know I'm interviewing with a competitor, I know about their product because I've trained on it before at my last job. But at the entry level, 90% of candidates show up and they think they're gonna sell themselves and their personality is what's gonna get them in the door. And if you spend literally 1 to 2 hours solidly researching that company's product, maybe one case study, maybe a quick white paper or summary of the major features that they have, you are already ahead of 90% of candidates that walk in the door. The third one, and I would say this is more as I've now broken into tech sales, cold calls are simply uncomfortable and weird because you've never done them before. They're not inherently bad. They're not inherently uncomfortable. It's literally your approach, and I don't want to get all mental like, oh, it's all state of mind. But literally, the only reason that a cold call is weird is because you've never done it before. And yes, it's going to feel weird right out of the gate, but so many people I see 6 to 9 to 12 months into the role, they still get nervous every time they're trying to call, and they haven't detached themselves from the outcome. Again, just boil it down to the most simple element of what a cold call is. You're trying to reach out, you're trying to see if they have a use case that your product solves for, and if it does, it would make sense logically to then take a call and explore further. Don't overcomplicate it. If someone hangs up, 90+% of the time they hate salespeople, they don't want to talk to you. It has nothing to do with who you are as an individual, and you need that feeling of a cold call to simply be normal. It's a part of your job. I've literally had people get upset that I'm calling them. I'm like, hey, I'm sorry, it's part of my job, and I saw you were a good fit for what we're doing, so my apologies, I just thought it would make sense to reach out. And this is the kind of mindset, again, it's not like I'm gonna make 100 dials a day and I'm gonna destroy the phone, but it's literally like, a cold call does not need to be this weird thing. It's just an exchange of information, and if it makes sense, you ask for a meeting. Again, on my next point, as you're actually in the job, I think so many people are worried about the outcome. I have to book this meeting. I have to attain it. And yes, you can't lose sight of that, because the flip side is if you're like, oh, I just want to call and I want to provide value, you lose the edge to ask for a meeting. You lose the ability to get that customer or that prospect that's kind of on the edge or on the fence and really have that killer mentality to get them into that meeting. But that being said, again, the important thing, especially early on, is to focus on the process. If you are learning, I think a lot of people breaking into tech sales, myself included, never having a quota-based role before, I was really worried about making sure I hit quota, making sure I do all these different things. And in reality, while no manager is going to say this directly to your face, Usually for the first 3 to 6 months, if you're really learning, if you're really putting effort forward, they're not so worried about direct quota attainment. Obviously exceptions, obviously if you're just not good at the job, you're not gonna survive, right? But again, especially early on, focus on the process. What can you learn? Who can you learn from? Who are the top performers on your team? Are you listening to their calls? Ideally, even more than you're reading about all the ins and outs of the features, etc. Because I think depending on the background you're coming from, like in my case, I have a problem where sometimes I go too deep into the features and then I start talking with prospects about things that don't really matter. So find that balance. Yes, study all of the white papers, study everything you can, listen to different podcasts, especially that first year in the role where they're talking about different sales strategies, all of these different things. You're probably familiar with channels like this that exist on YouTube, and I actively encourage you to look at other channels. But lastly, again, when you're focused and coming into work and saying, I usually need to make 50 dials a day to hit this number, I usually need to make 30 cold emails a day, I usually need to make 20 LinkedIn messages a day, connects, whatever it is, it helps detach from the emotional roller coaster of hitting or not hitting quota. You're simply just worried about putting yourself in a position to be there. And over time, especially if you're learning, especially if you're working hard and iterating on your approach constantly, the results will come. Lastly, kind of hitting on that point that we talked about of, yes, focus on the process, but don't forget raw sales skills. Don't forget the ability to close. And lastly, in summary, don't forget to ask for the sale, ask for the meeting, whatever it is. Obviously, there's a lot of context to this. You can't just call and ask for it right out of the gate. But I've seen in my own case as well, I say this from direct experience, when I got really good about product knowledge or when I started to be able to carry a conversation, I almost got carried away thinking about the next thing to say and the next feature to bring up, when in reality, I had already had a nice exchange with the prospect, and had I just asked for that meeting, they would have taken it. And so I know this is trivial, but especially as you get good at it, when you have good exchanges, don't be afraid to ask for that meeting. Because again, like one of the things, and again, a bad habit from my own experience, is I started to play 20 questions with a prospect because I was finally getting confident on the phone. And in reality, had I asked 3 good questions, which I did, and then associated their problem to what we solve for, that's enough justification for a meeting. Set the meeting and then continue to ask questions. And that's just one example of many. But I think a lot of people, when they're coming into sales, they either overcompensate, they think they have to be this incredibly confident, aggressive person, or on the flip side, they try and leverage and maybe come in with a little bit higher of an IQ, if you will. They're a little bit smarter and more conservative, but then they're not willing to make that ask. They're not willing to push for the sale, again, when it's contextually appropriate. So all that to say, if you're trying to break into tech sales, one, we do have a playlist that talks about numerous different elements of that, both interviewing, resume reviews, just broader knowledge of tech sales. But also, I do want to mention, again, and restating from this entire video, a lot of things when you break into tech sales for the first time feel really serious. And it's because you're doing it for the first time, and that's natural. But ideally, by educating yourself with this channel, with other channels, with podcasts, with books, etc., you're going to lower that barrier of how impossible of a gap it seems from where you're at today to where you want to go, and it will start to feel more normal. Just like in the example of cold calls. Cold calls, understandably, are very uncomfortable. It's just because you've never done it before. But if you get in the mindset that, hey, like, I am calling to see if there's a fit for our product, and if it does solve their problem, why wouldn't they want to talk about it? Same thing with an interview. It seems like this huge thing and you want to impress a manager and all these different things. If you've been studying about tech sales for 2 to 3 months, if you've been doing your research on this company and you clearly want to work there, like that's enough to have a great conversation. It doesn't have to be anything else than that. You don't have to overly sell yourself. Lastly, with my last point, is also don't be afraid to make that ask, right? I think so many people overcomplicate sales, and understandably, there's really only until 3 to 4 to 5 years ago, there wasn't a ton of great content about what tech sales is, what an SDR is. But now, as you continue to educate yourself, don't make it more than it has to be. And expect failure, expect that you will get some feedback that you didn't get the job or whatever, but that is a good learning experience. And if you have an objective and humble mindset going in, you'll quickly iterate and find a lot of success year 1, year 2, year 3, exponential returns and beyond. So appreciate it. Have a great week. Thanks.